Okay, good morning. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here and the first presenter at this workshop. Thank you for the welcome from our colleagues from the various agencies supporting this initiative. What I'd like to do now is to locate us in the reality of the global labour market, so that the discussions we have over the next 4 days will be rooted in a common understanding of the challenges that we're all facing. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is start by looking at some global labour market trends, because I think it's very useful for us to see what the environment is that we're working in and the commonalities between the different contexts in which we're working. Then I'm going to take some time to define a couple of key terms, because I think it's important that we have a common understanding of what we're talking about when we use certain terminology during the course of the week. Then I'm going to look a little bit about how social protection can contribute to employment. What are the linkages, and just try and map them out a little bit so we have a common map that we can refer to during the week. And then finally, I want to share with you some of the experiences which come from the international literature, from international experience, some of the challenges in trying to implement these kind of programs that link social protection and labour markets, because I think it's quite useful to look at what the generic issues are, the broader issues which affect programming globally. And so with this presentation, I hope to create a common basis for the week ahead. Okay, let's start a little bit by looking at the current global economic situation and the labour market situation. We're in a period of slowing economic growth. I think we were all shocked by the experiences of the triple F crisis in 2008 and 9, which had a major impact on poverty and employment. And then again, the 2016 crisis, which I think has had particularly profound effects in Latin America. And what we can see is that the situation we're facing now is that what's happening is that the employment being created globally isn't sufficient to absorb the growing labour force. That's our starting position. And what we actually are seeing currently is large-scale labour market failure. We'd all assumed that the regular functioning of a labour market would ensure that labour was absorbed in productive employment. But actually, what we see is a global crisis in terms of labour market failure. It's not behaving as we had all anticipated. And the consequence is a significant surplus labour supply in all our countries. We have more labour than we can productively use or can be productively absorbed into the economy. That's our crisis. And when labour is absorbed, we have a problem of chronic, poor quality employment. The employment which is being created globally is actually employment which leaves people in working poverty, which leaves them vulnerable. And we'll come back to look at this a little more. And I think what this means for social protection is that we've got a number of challenges. We heard from our presenters earlier about the conventional challenges of social protection during the life cycle, during childhood, during old age. But actually we have to think much more about the unemployed. We have to think about the working poor, and also we have to think about youth. And there's a new term in use at the moment, NEET. I don't know if you've come across it. It's the unemployed youth, not in education, employment or training. And this is a major group which is a concern to all of us, the NEETs. So during the course of this presentation, I'm going to come back to look at these different vulnerable groups and how we can accommodate them in our social protection work. So let's have some figures. I think figures are always useful. As an economist, I think figures sometimes tell a story much more simply and much more quickly than many words can. Globally, we've got 200 million people unemployed. That's 6% of the global labour force is unemployed. And unemployment is actually increasing by 2.7 million people annually, because labour force growth is simply larger than job creation growth. And this unemployment that we hear about, this 200 million, is concentrated disproportionately among the youth. And in fact, it's this large demographic shift, this growth in the youth, which is really driving unemployment. It's this large youth cohort which is driving labour force growth. And this is a concern because we know that early labour market exclusion has an impact on people's subsequent labour market performance. It has a sustained impact on social, economic, and security matters nationally. So this youth employment is a real concern. In some countries, it's presented as a youth dividend. You have an increase in labour, but the question is that labour is only a dividend if you can use it constructively. Okay, so we have an unemployment problem. I think that's clear. But also, the problem is the nature of the employment which we do have. So inasmuch as we have employment, much of it is vulnerable employment. And this is a term used by the ILO. It describes employment which is own account, when you're working for yourself, you're working for your family, it's informal employment, it's precarious, you can't be sure that you'll have employment the next week, you have no access to any kind of social security benefits. And interestingly, vulnerable employment is decreasing globally, but at a rate of less than 0.2 percentage points a year. So actually, it's an ongoing problem. It's not decreasing rapidly. So we have to think very carefully about this issue of vulnerable employment. And astonishingly, 4/5 of all workers in developing countries are in vulnerable employment. And this is very much concentrated in South Asia, where 75% of workers are working in vulnerable employment. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's 68%. And in these contexts, the real numbers are actually growing. So the rates are coming down slowly, but the numbers of people affected by these problems is growing in real terms. So let's think about the kind of income people make from employment and the question of the working poor. What we find is that recent ILO statistics indicate that 42% of workers globally live in poverty. That's on less than $3.1 a day. And what that means is 600 million people in emerging countries, 184 million workers in developing countries are working but living in poverty. 2/3 of the workers in developing countries are living in poverty. Again, the rate is declining slowly, but the absolute numbers are increasing. So the absolute numbers of workers who are living in poverty is going up. And these figures are quite astonishing. In South Asia, we have half the workers living under the poverty line and 1/5 of workers living in extreme poverty. Now that means 118 million people in South Asia are working but living in extreme poverty. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's actually a similar number. It's 1/3 of workers are living in extreme poverty. Now, I'm sorry for throwing all these numbers at you, but I think it's very enlightening to realize the scale of the problem that we have. And actually, it's a shared problem throughout the developing world and emerging economies. We have a real problem of the working poor. And these numbers for the extreme poor, I think, are quite shocking. Now, why is this happening? It's really a mixture of both cyclical factors to do with these recessions that I mentioned earlier, but also structural factors. And it's to do with both national issues and supranational issues. Some of them are issues which can be dealt with by national policy, but others, essentially unemployment and underemployment, is influenced by supranational factors, regional factors and global factors. Largely, at the moment, the problem is slow economic growth. But also we see that the kind of structural transformation which was anticipated in developing and emerging countries isn't happening in the way that had been anticipated. It's happening much more slowly. And those of you who have studied economics may be familiar with the Lewis model, which says that labor will move from low productivity activities in the rural sector to activity more highly remunerated activity, more productive activity in the industrial sectors. But actually this transition is not happening as had been anticipated in conventional economics. It's happening much more slowly, and it's happening in different ways. And so what we're seeing is that inasmuch as there is economic growth, it doesn't produce decent work. I think those figures on vulnerability and working poverty illustrate that. What we see is low productivity growth and increasing income inequality, and this prevalence of poor quality employment. It's sometimes called the decent work deficit. And this continued dominance of informal employment is really a key factor. So, let's just summarize where we are. What's the labor market problem that we're facing that we need to be thinking about this week? The first is that the reduction in employment and working poverty rates is happening, but it's happening slowly. We have an increase in the absolute numbers of people affected, and we have slow and unequal improvements. Different situations in Latin America where the major problem is the quality of employment, from sub-Saharan Africa, where the challenge is the retention of people in low productivity agricultural sectoral work. And what you see is that these improvements in the labor market situation are stagnating with economic slowdown. So when there's a recession, these problems become exacerbated. And overall, what we have is the growth of vulnerable, precarious employment. So some people talk about jobless growth. That's a very common phrase that you hear. But actually the problem isn't jobless growth, it's growth which is producing very poor quality employment. So what we have is in effect a crisis of adverse incorporation. We hear a lot about the need for economic inclusion, but the key question is, what are the terms of inclusion into the labor market? And we see that many people are incorporated into the labor market, but they're incorporated on terms which mean that their work is poorly remunerated, it's dangerous, it's precarious. So this is really the challenge that we face. And in fact, this labor market reality is a big challenge to the decent work agenda. And I think we heard about Sustainable Development Goal number 1, ending poverty, but actually Sustainable Development Goal number 8 is about providing decent work for all. And there's a commitment to provide decent work for all by 2030. But I think this snapshot of the global labor market situation illustrates quite what a challenge that's going to be. And just briefly, for those of you not familiar with the definition of decent work, it's actually work that's productive, gives a fair income, security. And in fact, I think looking at this definition of decent work, you can see quite how large the gap is between the kind of work that's being produced in our economies and the kind of work that we aspire to produce in our commitment to the decent work agenda. Okay, so what does this mean for social protection? Well, I think the key insight that we need to bear in mind is that employment isn't playing the anticipated role in poverty reduction. I think we all hope that employment would be the mechanism for reducing poverty on a large scale. But now we can see that employment per se can't actually perform that function. So this is going to be a major challenge for addressing SDG number 1. And I think what we see is that it's a particular challenge for social protection, because what role can social protection play? What role should it play? And I think clearly we can see that we have social unrest, we have mass migration. All of these are in part an expression of these kind of labor market crises. And so we need to think, what role can social protection play in actually addressing these social challenges? And I think it's also clear that we can't just think about social protection for those during points in the life cycle, a life cycle approach. We can't think of unemployment as a temporary situation. We need to think about unemployment as an ongoing norm for many people. And we need to also consider that even when employed, people may be in need of social protection, because we have this challenge of the working poor. So I think it really sets some new questions for social protection and some new challenges. And I just wanted to share a term with you which may be useful. It's transformational unemployment. I think we're all familiar with the conventional kinds of unemployment, frictional, structural, cyclical. But actually what we're seeing is a new kind of unemployment. We need to think differently about unemployment. And this really reflects the changing nature of economies in developing and emerging countries. We've got this kind of ongoing and incomplete economic transformation taking place. We've got urbanization, migration, this growth in informal employment I mentioned earlier. We've got changes in terms of regional and global labor market integration. we've got a breakdown in the kind of traditional economic structures, and even in traditional employment relations. You have this breaking down of production systems, which are fragmented across countries, and a much greater increase in outsourcing and informalization in production chains. So we have a whole new kind of economic structure that we have to reflect on. And this slowness of the structural transition out of low productivity activities to high productivity activities, happening much slower than anticipated. And then also this growth of the labor supply. And what this all adds up to is a sustained change in the nature of the global economy. This isn't some transient issue which is going to be resolved rapidly. This is the new reality that we face. And actually what it means is you've got chronic demand deficiency in terms of demand for labor. It's a chronic situation, a long-term situation. And we really need to think about this challenge of surplus labor, which isn't productively employed. And so that's transformational unemployment. That's our context for this week. But also I want to just say a little bit more about what we mean by the working poor. This group is referred to as the underemployed. That's the official terminology for this group. And they're workers who may well be engaged in productive activity, but they're either employed for less time than they'd like, or they're remunerated at a very low wage, which isn't sufficient to meet their needs. So it will be for less than a subsistence wage. And interestingly, this is equally relevant as a challenge in developing countries and developed countries. And we have this same problem of the working poor in the West. So this is actually a global problem that we face. And, but in developing countries, it's very much associated with low productivity work in the bottom segments of the labor market. And interestingly, this group is often excluded from social protection because there's an assumption that if you have labor, it can be used productively. But I think the emergence of this new group of the underemployed or the working poor shows us that actually these people who may be working full-time may still be in need of support because they may still fall well short of the poverty line. Okay, now a few words on how social protection can contribute to employment. Let's first just get a common understanding of what social protection is, because I think if we use shared terminology during the course of this week, it will be very helpful. Social protection is ongoing, regular, predictable state support provided on the basis of needs to meet basic consumption needs. And there's two main forms. The one is transfers, cash transfers, which may be conditional or unconditional. And the other is public employment programs, also known as public works programs, workfare, welfare to work, cash for work. And these are often used for the working age poor. And there's two very different kinds of public works programs. I just wanted to highlight this today because we'll come back to it in the week. One kind offers ongoing employment. And I think would the delegates from India make themselves known? Ah, lovely to meet you. And we'll be hearing later about an India program, the India program, which provides work for people on an ongoing basis. They can have repeated employment in these programs. And the wage serves as a kind of cash transfer to support the poor. But other kinds of programs, and we have the South Africa representatives at this table, good morning to you, will also be presenting. And in these programs, these public employment programs, the hope is to get people into productive employment. They have a short term of employment in the public works program, and then the hope is that they will move into the labor market. So we have two kinds of public employment programs. So in addition to cash transfers on one hand, and employment programs, the main social protection instrument, we also have a set of programs which are called maybe productive safety nets or graduation programs. And this is what we'll be seeing tomorrow when we see the SLP from the Philippines. Are there SLP representatives here? Hello, nice to meet you. Great, we'll be hearing more about that. And the Bangladesh, Mr. Hashemi, Professor Hashemi. Pleased to meet you, Professor Hashemi. We'll be hearing more about programs from the Philippines and Bangladesh, which are these kind of graduation programs. And these try and combine social protection interventions with a whole range of complementary interventions to promote employment and livelihoods outcomes. So basically this is the menu that we'll be dealing with in a week. Cash transfer programs, public employment programs, and complementary programs. And here's a schema. I don't know if you can see it or if it's too small. Basically, the way these programs function to address labour markets is, on the one hand, to promote the quality of labour supply, and on the other hand, to stimulate labour demand. Those are our two options in economics. If you want to promote employment, you can do it through two ways: labour supply, labour demand. And cash transfer and public works programs make a direct transfer to the household. And so in that way, it clearly can lift financial barriers to employment, and public works programs create additional employment. But then these complementary interventions can have a whole range of ways of promoting other issues to do with labour supply and labour demand. Some of these impacts are direct, some are indirect. I think we'll be giving you copies of these diagrams. So if you're having problems photographing them or seeing them, we'll be happy to share them with you. And it's these linkages that we're going to be exploring during the coming week. In what way, how can you ensure that these kind of complementary interventions work with cash transfers and public employment programs to really address labour supply and labour demand outcomes? So finally, I'd just like to share with you a few implementation challenges from the international experience, which I hope we'll be looking at during the course of the week. And I think, as we heard from one of the presenters earlier, last year the conference looked at design of programs. This year we're focusing on implementation issues. And I think if we review the international evidence, we see that there are a number of implementation issues which have a major impact on employment outcomes, on the extent to which social protection can affect employment. One is targeting. The next is the reliability of the transfer. And perhaps the most important one is actually program credibility. How do people feel about participating in the program? Are they confident that they will be having resources coming in on a regular basis which will enable them to change their labour market positioning? Is the scale of coverage adequate and the concentration of programming adequate to have these kind of spillover effects? Because we very much hope that through these programs we're going to be stimulating local economic development, but clearly there has to be a certain level of coverage and concentration before you start to get those benefits. The other issue is how well social protection is integrated with other developmental interventions. And I think this will be a key issue that we look at. How actually does one integrate social protection with complementary interventions? But finally, the most important issue, I think, overall, is the relevance of these interventions to the economic and labour market context. Because it's critical that programs are designed in such a way that they match labour demand and the economic potential of the local area. So, second slide on challenges. I think what we can say is it's clear the international evidence shows that social protection does have the potential to promote employment outcomes. It can lift some barriers to employment, but it's very clear that there's limited evidence so far of a sustained large-scale employment impact of graduation programs, of a sustained graduation out of poverty resulting from social protection. So we don't yet have evidence on that. And what we do see is that many programs which have low transfers, small-scale provision, short duration, and unreliable provision are limited in their potential to overcome labour market barriers. We also see that there are major difficulties in integrating complementary interventions with social protection. These link to personnel, experience, skill sets, contact time, access, institutional relationships, and even cost. These, the international literature suggests, are major barriers to linking social protection and complementary interventions. There's also a challenge of effective and relevant skills transfer. Are the skills which are being transferred really appropriate to labour market context? And if one looks at public works programs, there's a difficulty of producing the kind of productive assets which really contribute to employment. That's a major challenge. Also, there's a challenge that inasmuch as programs target, social protection programs target those who might graduate out of poverty, this can lead to a deprioritization of the poorest. And I think there's evidence emerging that some successful graduation programs deliberately do not target the poorest because they are the least likely to graduate, so there can be a tension there. Another challenge is that even when an intervention can help somebody to move into less adverse forms of employment, they're still likely to remain in the working poor. And I think we sometimes think that if people move into employment, they've moved out of poverty. But in fact, many people moving into employment are still remaining in poverty. So that's a challenge. And I think the other factor to remember is that structural barriers are the main constraint to employment. So social protection can lift some barriers, but actually there are structural barriers to do with economic development, macroeconomic policy, industrial policy, social norms. All of these can in fact be greater barriers to employment. So there are limits to what can be achieved through social protection. Okay, conclusion. I've done a whistle-stop tour there of the global economy, global labour market trends, key lessons in the social protection and employment literature. And I think really the major conclusion is that underemployment and unemployment are the major development challenges of our time. And that this problem isn't transient, it's not a temporary problem, it's a chronic problem, it's the development reality within which we're all working. And we have to really revisit orthodox assumptions, orthodox economics, which tells us there will be this transition of workers into higher productivity jobs, better remunerated jobs. That isn't happening. We have to throw away the textbooks and really think about a new kind of situation where chronic unemployment, underemployment, and precarious employment is the norm. We have to think about these issues of adverse incorporation, that labour market incorporation isn't necessarily the answer to poverty. And I think we have to conclude that social protection definitely does have a major role to compensate for this kind of labour market failure. There's no other instrument which can perform that function that we have at our disposal. And social protection does have the potential to reduce poverty and also to contribute to employment failure, to contribute to employment, to address this failure, if it's implemented on a large scale. But perhaps we have to acknowledge also that it has a limited role in terms of pathways out of poverty. And I think we need to be realistic in terms of the potential contribution that social protection can make and understand the limits of social protection in relation to these broader structural constraints. But that doesn't mean we don't do anything. We need to critically review the evidence. We need to see what works, what can we learn in order to have effective implementation. And we need new thinking about how we implement social protection in this new reality. And the cost of inadequate provision is high. It's high from a moral perspective, it's high from a political perspective, and it's also high from an economic perspective. If we don't address these problems, we're going to see increased migration, increased social unrest, political destabilization. These interventions link directly with future stability, both national stability, regional, and even global stability. So the stakes are high in terms of getting this right. And I think what we have in the week ahead is actually a unique opportunity. This is a workshop which is different from other workshops. We're not just telling people about our programs, we're telling people about what we've learned, how we've overcome the challenges, and how we've actually attempted to address some of these problems which I've just shared with you. And so I think I invite you in the week ahead to really engage with these issues and to share your experience so that we can all learn and really improve the quality of our programming in order to contribute to improved social protection and to improved employment. Thank you.